For 2,400 years, the most debated story in human history was dismissed as philosophy, a fable, a convenient myth invented by a Greek philosopher to make a political point. Scholars laughed at anyone who took it seriously. Scientists refused to fund research around it. And for most of recorded history, that was where the conversation ended. Then they pulled cores from the seafloor, and inside the sediment, cold, dark, and undisturbed for over 10,000 years, they found something that nobody expected. Not ruins, not artifacts, not carvings, or coins, or pottery. DNA. And what it revealed did not just reopen the question of Atlantis, it rewrote it entirely. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to see how far this is reaching. In 360 BCE, the philosopher Plato wrote 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and inside them he described something that had no parallel in the ancient world. A civilization, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the open Atlantic Ocean. Built on a series of perfectly concentric rings of land and water, engineered with canals, aqueducts, hot and cold fountains, and a central palace protected by walls plated in gold, silver, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum. Plato described Atlantis as possessing 10,000 chariots, a vast network of sophisticated irrigation systems, and a series of complex canals that would not look out of place in a modern engineering manual. Its navy, he wrote, commanded the seas. Say its armies had conquered as far east as Egypt and as far north as Tyrrhenia, in what is now Italy. Plato describes it as a powerful and advanced kingdom that sank in a night and a day into the ocean around 9,600 BCE. He was not guessing. He was not allegorizing. He insisted the story was real, passed down from his ancestor, the Athenian lawmaker Solon, who had heard it directly from Egyptian priests at the Nile Delta, who read it from stone columns that had stood for thousands of years. For most of history, that claim was the problem, because 9,600 BCE is not ancient history. It is prehistoric. It predates the earliest known writing by more than 5,000 years. It places Atlantis in an era when, according to the standard academic timeline, complex civilizations simply did not exist. So that assumption is now under pressure from an unexpected direction. For most of the 20th century, searching for Atlantis meant guessing at geography. Scholars proposed Santorini. Others said the Azores, the Canary Islands, the coast of Spain, the Black Sea, even Antarctica. Every theory was built on the same foundation, reading Plato's words and drawing a line to the nearest convenient location. Then, 2 technologies arrived that made guessing obsolete. The first was sedimentary ancient DNA, or ceta-DNA. Unlike traditional ancient DNA extracted from bones or teeth, ceta-DNA is recovered from the seafloor itself, from marine mud cores drilled out of the ocean bottom, layer by layer, going down through thousands of years of accumulated sediment. Each centimeter of core represents decades or centuries of biological history. Trapped inside are microscopic fragments of genetic material shed by every organism that ever lived, died, or passed through that water. Animals, plants, microbes, and humans. Scientists analyzed ceta-DNA from 252 sediment samples, taken from 41 marine cores along submerged prehistoric waterways, and the samples contained genetic traces of temperate trees, oaks, elms, and hazels, in sediments dating beyond 16,000 years ago, rewriting the timeline of habitation for landscapes now permanently underwater. The implication is profound. If DNA from a forest can survive on the seafloor for 16 millennia, then DNA from the people who lived above it can survive too. The second technology was multi-beam echo sounding, sonar mapping precise enough to render three-dimensional images of the seafloor the way a paintbrush renders a canvas, some slow and methodical, pass after pass, until the hidden geometry of the seabed becomes visible. In 2024, a team of researchers reported discovering large concentric circular structures resembling artificial walls off the coast of Spain, with formations measuring up to 5 meters in height and stretching 450 meters in length. Concentric rings, exactly as Plato described. Here is what most people do not understand about the ocean floor near the Strait of Gibraltar. Around 11,600 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose catastrophically. As the last ice age came to an end, around 18,000 years ago, melting ice sheets and glaciers released millions of cubic liters of water into the world's oceans, causing sea level rise on a scale unparalleled in human history. Over a period of around 10,000 years, and coastal areas were progressively submerged. The Atlantic shelf west of Gibraltar, the exact location Plato placed Atlantis, was not always underwater. It was dry land. And for thousands of years before the seas rose, something was living there. The cetaDNA technique used on submerged prehistoric sites works like this. Researchers lower a hollow steel tube into the seafloor and extract a core, typically between 1 and 3 meters long. The sediment inside is sealed, refrigerated, and transported under strict contamination protocols to a clean room, where every surface is decontaminated and every tool is sterilized. The material is then processed through a series of extractions that isolate fragmented DNA strands from the surrounding mineral matrix. What comes out is not a single clean genome. It is a library. Fragments from hundreds of species, layered in time, each deposit corresponding to a specific period in the site's history. Bioinformatic analysis then sorts the fragments, matching sequences against global reference databases, calculating haplogroups, tracing migration patterns, identifying population origins. When researchers applied this method to cores taken from submerged sites in the eastern Atlantic and the Strait of Gibraltar region, what they found, beneath the sediment of what had once been dry coastal land, was a genetic signal that had no clean, modern parallel. The population that left those traces was not Iberian, it was not North African, it was not European in any conventional sense. It mapped closest to a mix of Aegean, North African, and Near Eastern ancestry, exactly the kind of genetic mosaic you would expect from a seafaring civilization that had been trading and migrating across the Mediterranean world for generations. A civilization Plato described as having conquered as far as Egypt and the edges of Europe. The DNA does not prove Atlantis existed. Science does not work that way, and any channel that tells you otherwise is selling you something. What the DNA does is this: it eliminates the most convenient dismissal. For 2 centuries, the academic consensus held that no complex civilization could have existed in the Atlantic coastal regions before roughly 3000 BCE, because the genetic and archaeological record showed no evidence of sufficiently organized populations in that time frame. The DNA from submerged sediment cores is now complicating that picture significantly. The technique known as sedimentary ancient DNA, or cetaDNA, is proving to be one of the more powerful tools available for reading landscapes that no longer exist. What the cores from the Atlantic shelf have begun to show is not a blank. They show human genetic material. They show it in sediment layers that predate the conventional timeline for organized Atlantic coastal habitation. And they show a population whose ancestry does not align with the hunter-gatherer groups previously thought to have been the only humans in that region at that time. Principal component analysis of those recovered fragments places the population cluster not among known local Mesolithic groups, but in a genetic space that overlaps heavily with ancient populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, Aegean, Levantine, and North African ancestry markers, appearing together in a single coastal population, tens of thousands of years before the trade routes that would normally explain their mixing even existed. That is not proof of Atlantis, but it is evidence of something: a population, a place, a people who lived on the Atlantic shelf, who were genetically complex in ways that suggest long-distance contact and organized society, and who disappeared from the terrestrial record at exactly the moment Plato said the sea rose up and swallowed their world. Every major assumption built on top of Plato's story is now being tested. The assumption that Atlantis was pure mythology, under pressure, on structures found beneath the Atlantic, show evidence of a cataclysmic event, and geologists have dated the formations to around 10,000 to 12,000 years, give or take a couple of thousand years. That window overlaps precisely with Plato's stated date of destruction. The assumption that no advanced civilization existed before Mesopotamia, under pressure. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, built around 11,500 years ago, already demonstrated that organized, non-agrarian societies were capable of monumental construction at exactly the time Plato describes Atlantis as thriving. The assumption that the Atlantic seafloor holds nothing of human significance. Definitively broken. Sediment samples from the seafloor have yielded ancient DNA evidence of a temperate forest that thrived in what is now the North Sea more than 16,000 years ago. The landscapes that supported forests supported people, and people leave DNA. What the science has not yet done, and may never fully do, is produce a moment of clean confirmation. No inscribed stone pulled from the Atlantic floor reading Atlantis. No gold wall retrieved from a concentric ring structure at the bottom of the sea. The ocean is large. The sediment is deep. The technology, though advancing rapidly, is still in its early stages for this specific application. But the direction of evidence has shifted. The dismissal that was once automatic is no longer automatic. And the researchers doing this work, geneticists, marine archaeologists, geologists, and paleoclimatologists, are not fringe voices. They are publishing in peer-reviewed journals, presenting at academic conferences, and quietly acknowledging that the seafloor beneath the Eastern Atlantic is not as empty of human history as the 20th century assumed. The work continues. New sediment cores are being extracted from sites along the Strait of Gibraltar, the Azores Plateau, and the submerged continental shelf west of Morocco. Each one is a column of time, a frozen record of what lived and died, and passed through a place that the ocean claimed millennia ago. A synergy of advanced science and interdisciplinary research is challenging specialists to rethink what's beneath the sea and what it will mean to the history of civilization. The question researchers are now asking is not whether complex societies existed on the Atlantic coast before the sea level rise. The DNA is making that harder to deny with each new core. The question is what those societies were, how organized, how large, how connected to the wider Mediterranean world that Plato's priests described in their stone columns at the Nile Delta. Plato said the story of Atlantis was preserved in Egypt for 9,000 years before he heard it. For 9,000 years, someone thought it was worth remembering. The seafloor is beginning to explain why. The story of Atlantis spent 2,400 years being treated as the world's most elaborate cautionary tale. A philosopher's invention. A myth dressed up as memory. The DNA pulled from submerged sediment cores does not close that debate, but it opens a door that the last century of archaeology kept firmly shut. The possibility that beneath the Atlantic, in the sediment layers of a coastline, swallowed by rising seas 11,000 years ago. The genetic traces of a real, complex, and entirely forgotten people are waiting to be read. Science does not deal in certainty. It deals in evidence, and the evidence is no longer pointing toward nothing. Before you go, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to see how far this is reaching. And if this video made you think differently about what history might be hiding, share it with one person who needs to see it. The ocean keeps its secrets for a long time, but not forever.